I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter, and I'm very pleased and excited and honoured to be joined today by Bernard Sweeney and Dylan Foley. Hi, folks. How are you both doing?
Jane, how are you?
Very
Right.
well, thanks, Bernard.
Good.
Hi now. Yeah, how you doing?
Thanks for joining me, lads. So maybe to begin with, you can just both tell me a little bit about yourselves and your background, please. Maybe starting with you, Bernard.
Yeah, no worries. I'm an Irish traveller. I'm based here in Sligo, and I have no formal qualifications. I had little to no formal education. So I don't come at this as an academia or anything like that. So your discipline is perfectly fine and safe. There might be things that I might know that you might not know, but that might not have to do with your discipline. That would be just backgrounds and culture and so on and so forth. So yes, I grew up in Sligo. It wasn't easy. It was quite tough. But considering to other travellers around the country, it seemed a lot better than most places. So yeah, and I grew up with, I guess, like a lot of travellers, like people in the west of Ireland, because a lot of people get confused about the traveller identity. And maybe if I just real quickly just said out loud, real quick, what
Sure.
I think traveller is, so the audience who are watching may get some context. Because if I keep talking within a vacuum, it might be difficult to process.
Sure.
So I would say that Irish travellers is a label that came from English colonization of Ireland. And before the English colonization of Ireland, there was no labels called travellers. There was no labels called itinerants. There was no labels called thinkers. There was no labels called indigenous or native or nomads or vagrants. All them labels were a process of English colonization. So who were we then if the English didn't put all these labels on us? And we know through science and a lot of research is that, and common knowledge within our community, because it's something that we've been saying for decades and even centuries, but somehow or another, it seems to always get misconstrued of what we're trying to say. So I would say that we are the last of the Gaelic clans
Okay.
that has survived just about every storm that ever was. And when you hear about travellers about breaking away from the settled people, that is not true. We didn't come from an industrial world. Fergus Shanahan, who is a microbiome expert, would tell you that our environment did come from an ancient background, where the
Okay.
settled one came from an industrial one. So when there was a divergence between the travelers and the settled, and when they were saying that even the scientists had it in their narrative, not their science. Science
Mhm.
is perfect, I'm no doubt, but they had it in their narrative that Irish travelers diverged from the settled
Mhm.
population at a particular time. And this was echoed by Enda Kenny in the Dáil of the Recognition, symbolical as it was, that we were a people within a people. So that
Okay.
narrative would suggest that we were some kind of failed settled people or
Mm.
some kind of lower class settled people. When in actual fact, we didn't come from the settled class systems at all. We all came from the west of Ireland, particularly Sligo, with a Gaelic background. So that's if that helps any of your viewers
Yeah,
or
yeah.
audience.
No, it's great. Thank you, Bernard. And I'll turn to you, Dylan. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, please?
Hello, Dylan Foley. I'm also from Sligo.
Excellent.
Yeah, I grew up the same town, same town, same time, same age more or less as Bernard. But I wouldn't have met Bernard until much later. I suppose the usual thing would be travelers and settled people.
Hmm.
Would Yeah, the usual thing. We wouldn't have mixed that much. Um, but I'm an archaeologist by trade, I suppose, if you want to call it that. I worked a lot during the Celtic Tiger a lot on the road schemes, that kind of thing. I was a field archaeologist for a good many years. So obviously I have an interest in, well, more than an interest in Irish history and the deeper aspects of Irish history and where everything comes from and where we all come from and all that kind of thing. And in later years, obviously the last so many years, I've worked with well, on various things and particularly with Bernard as well on sorting out as much as we can, try to get into all this kind of stuff about our history of the island and travelers and settled and where does everyone come from and that kind of thing, which has actually been revolutionized and is still being revolutionized by genetic studies.
Hmm.
But it's making sense of those kind of studies and things like that. So we're still researching, but we've made a lot of progress too, we think. So
Thanks,
that's where I'm
Dylan.
coming from.
And you both have a podcast together, isn't that right? You kind of co-host.
Yeah, we do. Well, there's a team of us in Trision Foundation, and we're kind of a mixed bag. Myself and Dylan, we could say started off, because we're working together a few years before we met anyone else. So
Okay.
the next person I think came along would have been Ninessa, and you've met Ninessa in the
Yeah.
podcast, and she would have lived in Australia for years, and she's a psychologist also. So I got the benefit of the psychologist and the archaeologist, which I
Brilliant.
truly needed because I was trapped between worlds. I didn't have
Mhm.
the formal know-how and so on and so forth. So that can be a bit of a lifesaver. Well, not to mention other travelers who also supported me throughout the years,
Mhm.
even at my lowest points. So yeah, and that's what Travision is. That kind of, it's a mixed bag. Both of them, and Phoebe, the wonderful Phoebe, also a master of accounting and stuff like that.
So important.
Yeah, because we're a registered, and as I said, we don't. There's a lot of skills we don't have, but we do have a narrative and a mentality, which kind of shares well with Dylan's because, as you said, we come from the west of Ireland and we
Mhm.
come from Sligo, and then it would make more sense because Dylan was telling me that Sligo kind of resisted a lot of the colonial, a lot of the psychological colonial input.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we were kind of saved from that alone. I
Mhm.
think this is why our stories are so collaborating together
Mm.
because our narrative fitted his archaeology, but
Okay.
that wasn't ever going to be enough.
Yeah.
So then we got the geneticists, and we thought this is brilliant. And the geneticists don't tell us anything about culture, or identity, or
Yeah.
what you ate, or what you felt, or your emotions. It just tells you there's a map where your ancestors came from, and of course this fitted with the archaeology. There was the
Mhm.
divide. This is what's going on at this particular time. The narrative of the travelers saying the exact same thing. So we had the science, the narrative, and the archaeology. But unfortunately, that wasn't enough because unfortunately, a lot of people don't like hearing about geneticists. They have particular kind of feelings around it.
Yeah.
And I was meeting this even from very influential people involved with travelers that they were just putting their hand up saying, no, we're not doing anything with geneticists. You could sound like a right wing going
Yeah.
on.
A bit scared. I think people can get a bit scared by
Yeah,
talking about genetics sometimes. Yeah.
absolutely. But on in my world, where I was coming from, that our world was already being crushed. I
Yeah.
had a nephew who took his life, uncles who took their lives, aunt who took their life, grandfather who was murdered, mother died who was very young. So we were surrounded with death and
Yeah.
emergency. So I thought the DNA, regardless of what's people's perception, on this incident, it
Mm.
was going to save lives. It was going to give
Okay.
back something to travelers that has been taken for so long. But that wasn't enough. Then one day through our podcast, which we were asking about, and meeting wonderful people like you, some of the bravest people, I think it should be said that did you study in Limerick University or Cork?
Pork.
Cork. And had you anything to do with Limerick?
Well, I work at Limerick. Yeah, I work at
Yeah,
the University of
it's
Limerick.
just in recent times, it's been Limerick that keeps calling us up. They want us to come down and talk about even Irish history, but from a traveller perspective. It was
Brilliant.
They brought us German young students, PhD and master students, to come and talk to us about traveller history.
I'm delighted
Um,
to hear it.
yeah, so and Anka, I don't know if you met Anka down there also. But yeah, there's wonderful people down there,
Oh,
and
Minescu, is it?
yeah,
Yes, I have met her. Yeah.
wonderful. And this brings us back to Cork actually, because Fergus Shanahan is at
Hmm.
Cork University, and he was like the final piece of the jigsaw for me. Give me back all my sanity, all the things that people said you were mad about and crazy about, and I had it. I healed, and I was still healing from it. But he was telling us that everything that we've been saying, he finds all of that in his science.
Okay.
And he said that's exactly what we're seeing. When we explained that we didn't come from the settled people with the same Irish names came from our world because we never moved from it. So how would we be the outsiders and different?
Mm-hmm.
So he's saying actually that's what's showing up. And he believes that his ancestors would have had the same microbiome as travelers have today. But of our industrialization, has changed their microbiome and has
Mm-hmm.
killed it off and replaced it with something else. So this is science. This is like the finest science we've ever heard because,
Yeah.
and what for me, it justified all of the painstaking deaths, that all the deaths weren't because people thought and we were portrayed as and projected as destitute,
Mm.
that we really needed charity. We needed the church. We needed the state. What we needed was support to get back up on our feet. But
Sure.
instead, we found ourselves locked into a very complex assimilationist
Mm.
program that was never told to travellers or never informed about. They just woke up one morning like that. Is it 1938 War of the Worlds, Oscar Wilde or H. Wilde's? But basically, they replaced this normal radio station and they fitted in their film. So it
Right.
started off with the symphony orchestra, it started off with the weather. So this is 1938. So people were sitting down believing they were listening to the radio. So this guy breaks in with an emergency broadcast and said that a meteor has come through the sky and has landed. And before you knew it, aliens were coming out of it and they were killing everyone. Well, in real life, because people were never told, well, what I'm reminded enough times is this is fiction.
Yes.
So what they did was they thought it was real. So they practically, I don't know why I'm laughing about it, they practically burned down the town, they burned down the police station, they burned down the radio station because people got such a fright. Panic. Yeah. And this is exactly now this is where reality meets fiction. In 1960s, the state with their assimilationist program had put out national broadcasting about the itinerants, and they read out the terms of references and stuff like this. And before you know it, there was radio shows, even back then, talking about diseases and stealing and robbing. Right. And so they put out through the nation, without travellers even knowing about it, that these people were a threat to the state. They were a threat to settle people. They were a threat to their property. And that's where you got people believing these narratives. And the strangest thing, of course, before 1960, there was never anything remotely like what there is now between travellers and settled. It didn't exist. So what
you mean the fears and kind of suspicion and hostility at times, on a mutual way at times too, perhaps.
There was always a difference. But if you go into, say, the west of Ireland, the further you go back, because now we're travellers, but before that we would have been tinkers and itinerants, and them labels have an origins themselves. So there was a kind of a divide, what we call, it was more clannish, but them divides have been there 1,000 years, because not everybody in the Gaelic world was at the same kind of operating level. There was different sections to it. There was in groups, there was out groups, there was warrior class groups, there was bardic poets, and so on and so forth. So not everybody was the same in the Gaelic world either. So now we always had them maintain them differences from going back centuries, I'd imagine. But we also knew that many travellers, even my own people, had group housing long before they knew what group housing was. So the concept of traveller being a nomad type person, a homeless, that's just a label, because that also applied for all the people who were living in the houses who were related to these people. And if we go back far enough, we actually know there's Sweeneys and there's McDonoughs and there's Rileys who live deep in the country who are our relations, but divide through the 1960s onwards made people terribly ashamed to be associated with this group. Sorry for the rant, but there you have it.
No, you're a grant. And we'll come back to that, because anyone living in Ireland, whether they were, whether they're Irish or not, learns quickly enough about travellers and some of these, the fears or some of the problems within the community as represented in the media and from traveller groups indeed. But I'd like to talk a bit about the positives of the culture, because I know there are many, from having read stuff and met people. And hopefully we will all children will learn a bit more about traveller culture in schools now. What would you, Bernard, as a proud traveller man, like people to know about your culture?
Yeah, it's not even a case of would we like them to know, because again, I'll reference 1960s. The commissioners went out and they talked to these itinerants, and they found them very intelligent and engaging, and did not feel inferior to the settled people. So we were never trying to impress settled people about our culture and our identity. We're not trying to impose it upon them. It was the settled people that turned us slightly into a circus carnival, romanticizing history and so on and so forth, when we weren't all that bothered about it at all, because
you were just living your lives.
Not in depth. We had this. We knew the difference. Like when I was 4 years old, I knew, even in the west of Ireland, that there was a psychological barrier between us and these country people. That there was something different between us. So when I grew up, throughout all that time, even the next school, I was put into one classroom and kept at one chair for 5 years. So I had a lot of time to think and process, because we also came from a proud culture, wrong, right, or whatever people think of it. We came from a fighting warrior class culture in my own lifetime.
Yeah.
We had chieftains and we had leaders and we had rows and we had fights and so on and so forth. But that was just our state of arrested development in many ways. We were locked into that world because the settled world was always fuzzy to us. It was like we just didn't fully, it was a bit static. We didn't understand it, but we knew they were different. But of course, later life, you start to learn a lot about the settled culture because, if you don't, you're going to die. Because one, they're telling you that you're a criminal, that you're this labeling, you're that labeling. What's incredible about these labels is that these labels were here long before I was born.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking about my experiences, I'm not talking about I at all, because we rarely use the word I in Travelers. It's always
So interesting.
our people, my people, our community. We do it as often as anyone else in different contexts, but we always had someone who, the only person who could say I this and I that was the senior in the family, more or less.
Wow.
Or the appointed person who we thought was a fair play person. But of course, in the settled world, they were seeing gangs, and they thought our spokesperson was the head of a gang. In our world, it was just a different program. We were sorting out issues in a very civilized manner that didn't require state assistance. Not that we ever got it in the first place. So I would say to people, if you want to learn about traveler culture, it's very, very, very simple. Much of it is actually already there. And you have to do a reverse psychology on this one. We need to learn about settled people's culture. Because if we learn about the settled people's culture and where they got their foundation, where they got their institutions, where they got their systems, where did they get their names, their labels, their attitudes, and their mentality, once we figure that out, we know exactly then who everybody else is.
Okay.
Because, as I mentioned earlier, how we're connected to Gaelic clans and that mentality, it's not that we believe for a second that we want to bring history forward. It's not for a present moment that we want to romanticize it or relive it. What we're clearly saying, in many ways, respectively, is that we're not the people stuck in the past. It is the settled people who have never changed any of the English colonial systems. Even in 1922, they all ran through. So they continue to educate a population to see the world through an English lens. I mean, if you're calling us travelers today, 102 years later, after Irish independence, and you call us thinkers and you call us itinerants, they are the labels the English came up with. They're the labels that were put on Gaelic clans. So now we have a physical structure to carry through 1922, but we also have a psychological structure to carry through 1922, because the early experiments with Edmund Spencer and people like that were hell-bent on changing the Irish psyche. So if they could change the Irish psyche into an English one that was obedient to the state, that would be a win-win for everyone. And this is why we have so much, even today with settled people, and they're always fighting each other who's more Irish and calling each other traitors and whatnot, or they call each other West Brits or Protestants. We're not from that world. Like our microbiome and our DNA and our narrative has always said we didn't come that direction. That direction came elsewhere. So I would say that learning traveler history is learning about all the great clans, Gallowglass, bards, all the poets. They're all our people. We've never left that channel. That's who travelers are, really.
Okay, interesting. Thank you, Bernard. Dylan, is there anything that you would like to add to that you think would be beneficial for kids in school and indeed adults to learn about traveller culture?
Well, I think Bernard. I mean, I would go along with Bernard on there. I think that what he marks out there is exactly what we've been working on, which is in a way, although it seems complicated at first, it's actually simpler than people think. That actually leading it back in, it leads everyone back into their history on the island. Because we have a sort of somewhat conflicted history, one that maybe people are afraid to get into sometimes because of the trauma and the troubles and all that kind of thing. But it's well known. I mean, even the positives. As Bernard said, he's trying to break those labels, and I would agree with that, because when we stand back and look at the picture over a longer period of time, and in a bigger perspective, we can see that these are just kind of, they're different labels put on things, and too often the um the majority culture kind of doesn't have to look at itself. So he's right,
Hmm.
maybe it's to point in that
We have to
direction.
hold up that mirror and reflect.
Yeah, yeah, because the problem isn't like there isn't a problem that's over there. That's this community is the problem. That's what Bernard touched on there. That
Mm.
idea, and I was surprised when I was first talking to Bernard a few years back on these issues. I was surprised 1963 reports that he would reference there when the state first decided, this modern state decided to kind of get into having a program of what they were going to do with the itinerant problem, as they put it at the
Mm.
time. I mean, you can see where it's going to go wrong there.
Hmm.
But I was surprised. You can see at the very beginning of the preamble of that report is that the one thing they had a whole coterie of experts of various types and non-experts and politicians and priests and all kinds of people involved in this report. No travelers, but I think, as far as I remember, isn't that right, Bernard, on the board of the '63 report thing?
Yes,
But
yeah.
interestingly, they one thing they did say was they were not going to go into the history. They weren't going to look at any history.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
This was out. This was definitely out. There was no way the past was relevant. All that was relevant was they were that what they're going to do now. So, and it's all too complicated, the past, so we won't even deal with it.
Mm.
And of course, that just leaves everything wide open for like a kind of whatever political programs they had or whatever. And so, and as we've been through, and as Bernard would describe, since that time, even no matter how well-meaning things were at that time, things got worse and worse right up to our time. So obviously, whatever this idea was of leaving out the past and leaving out any idea of how this had all come to be this way, really hadn't worked. And as Bernard said, outcomes for travelers were fairly in a really bad and still are, but really were in a terrible condition a few years ago. And yeah, and so we set out on that path of like, well, obviously the positives you're talking about. I mean, everyone would say that, but conditions, the living conditions, the life expectancies, and many statistics for travelers were getting worse and worse. So how could it be, as Bernard had said to me many times, how could it be that the more that people try to help or the state supposedly tries to help, how could things be getting worse all the time? You
It's a
know?
great question.
So we were, yeah. So I mean, but it's, as we said, it was straightforward. I mean, when we look at, we had another opportunity when we start to look at things like genetics and that, but not that they tell us as directly what's going on, but it's that stories that travelers and others had already told, and they were well known. When you asked about positives, I would have said, people that we would know about music and stories and many other aspects of the Irish culture that were kept and kept alive by travelers. And yet at the same time, they would have also been saying things all along about, like, maybe not in a scholarly manner that the settled world would recognize, but in their own way, about what their history had been and where they had come from, and that, even, more or less, that they'd been where they'd been
Mm.
since they could remember. But this was very rarely taken seriously, except, put in, not by academia anyway.
Mm.
And although it collected as folk stuff, and there's plenty of people respecting it, but it still was not put into any policy or investigated, and still history was left out.
Yes,
Um,
it was subjective, a handful of people's perceptions of the world as opposed to
yeah,
truth or reality kind of thing.
yeah, and there's an invisible assumption behind it. There was an assumption that whatever history was there, it had to be that the settled people had always been there and they were normal.
Mm.
They were the normal culture, and whatever travelers were, whatever the details were, they were the ones that were the anomaly, if you know what I mean. And
Mm.
although you could have a positive view or a negative view about travelers, but they'd still be an anomaly. So there was
Yeah.
still an assumption behind it that somehow they're the ones that are out of kilter.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
of course, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Thanks, Dylan. I think I had this exchange with you before, Bernard, as well, that like going way, way back into the kind of history and the origins of humankind and hunter-gatherer groups, like all humans were in small little family kinship bands for the most part. There was not that many people, and they did often move. They moved to find food, or they moved after their houses were demolished by um, rampaging tribes or whatever else. So actually, the idea of settled people, that is a comparatively modern thing anyway in the history of humankind, aside from Irish travelers at all. And we kind of, I think we presume a lot of the time that we've been sophisticated for a lot longer, maybe, and civilized for a lot longer than we've been. And Bernard made the interesting point about industrialization and all of that. Could I just ask you one thing about the kind of clans and the fighting, Bernard, because I think it's interesting in terms of some of the stereotyping or even the misunderstanding of behavior as well. Like, again, tribes down through time have sorted things out, have moved away from each other if things got too hot. That then became impossible in Ireland as well when travellers couldn't move anymore, and it left limited options sometimes for dispute resolution. Is there anything that you'd like to say about this concept of feuding, and is it a problem in the community or does it harm the community?
Yeah, it's trying to find a starting point. Once,
Yeah.
once I was, because I mentioned earlier about no formal education, but doesn't mean I didn't learn how to self-educate. And I don't have no notion in my head that I'm smarter or better than anyone with a qualification. I know they are far more smarter than I could ever be because they studied it. But there's aspects of what people say that fit my psyche, that fit my world, and
Mm-hmm.
helps me to patch things together and things like that. So I would say when I found out that we were also, not we as in travelers, but we as a human species are 50% genetically related to bananas. I just knew that was half the battle. Uh, Nothing then that would surprise me. So when we talk about gatherer hunters who are
Yeah.
dark skin complexion and blue eyes,
Yeah.
when we talk about the Normans and the systems and whatever we talk about, it has a great deal of irrelevance. The
Mm-hmm.
only relevance that we see in history is what is happening right now in the present.
Right.
When we find out that we have issues with the legal system and the medical system and the educational system and land rights systems and political systems, when we have issues with all these systems, we have to also ask, where did all these systems come from? And
Mm-hmm.
how long has this conflict gone on? So to put it in a kind of a time line, say we're here now in the present. So the issues that are affecting us have an origin. They have an old origin. And when we take a step back, because we didn't come from there, it makes it that bit easier to take a step back. When we take a step back, we got the present day here, and then we go back in time, we have the origins of our conflict, which
Mm-hmm.
primarily, I'd say, really began in the 16th century because it became an all Ireland expansion of colonization. So we're
Mm-hmm.
under English rule, English laws, and that has remained that way for centuries. So that's the kind of taking a step back. So in the present, why would history be important to anyone? Well, it's important to us because the problems we're having now around ethnicity and identity and children killing themselves is because the history is greatly misunderstood by the general population, and I would say even the Irish state, because we
Mm-hmm.
do know that the psychological thing carried through 1922 and the physical aspect carried through 1922. So we're in the present now. I'd say it in a way that you and I and Dylan are here talking, communicating through this language and this mentality. So we share a kind of a commonality
Mm-hmm.
because we're from Ireland. We would also look around and we say, this is reality. This is real. This is perception, of course, on individuals' minds. But
Mm-hmm.
in general, we would say physically, materialistically, this is reality. And then I would say something strange like saying, like, we did not come from here. This is not our language. This is not our mentality. This is
Yeah.
not our reality. In actual fact, it's not even your language or your mentality,
Yeah.
your reality. It came
We
from.
lost our language. Yeah.
So we're here now, we're in the now, in the present, but you can understand where our cultural mentality comes from. We're physically here with you guys, but psychologically we're not. We're not from here. So to talk about the conflict, we have to talk about the overarching problem. Like in Christianity, there's 34,000 different dominions, and each one of them are convinced that they are the right Christians. And who's to know? There's 34,000 of them. I tell you, sort it out yourselves. But what they do have in common, because in them small groups, you got different languages, different cultures, different skin complexions, but they have an overarching connection, which is Christianity itself. So they share in that mentality. So when we're talking about, say, traveler issues here in the now, people should keep in mind that we have never left a colonial environment. That overarching 16th century systems, institutions, acts, laws, and policies are still actively targeting travellers and the Irish language and sometimes Protestants, and depends. It's done subconsciously, Jane. So there's no one to blame unless you're over 500 years old. Then that's if you're not, I swear to you, it's nobody's fault. There's no guilt tripping. There's no like bad settled people. There is no bad settled people. And in our platform with Trision Foundation, we do see beyond that colonial mentality, the Western one, because what happened in Ireland went global. It became the Virginia in America, it became Australia, it became Canada. It was the same English colonial system that ran through, but it all began here in Ireland. So we're not trying to guilt trip people. We're trying to say, we're trying to give you back something that is clearly missing within your own environments. Because even professors in Trinity College and Maynooth College, because I was always told, what would I know? I didn't even go to school. They say, you're telling me that you know more than the guys in Trinity College, Maynooth College. You know more than the guys in Europe. And I was into travel. I couldn't even process myself how I didn't know. I couldn't prove it. I only knew it because it was in me since a child.
Yeah,
and we grew up.
You felt it.
Yeah, we grew up in this environment. We know it, but we can't explain it. And of course, then with all the assimilation, all the cultural elements were getting destroyed and cut off. So now we're in a house, in a housing estate, and you sound like a mad person talking about cultures and identities and mentalities. But yeah, you're going to ask about conflict, but maybe you want to come back to me in a moment.
Yeah. No worries. No, it was just that some of the things that you said there were very interesting. Just around the clans and the origins, but how then does colonialism have an enduring impact on you guys in a negative sense? Because I presume there are not too many positives from colonialism in this regard. But does can we say, or do you feel, and has your research that you've done together kind of helped establish that colonialism has played a role in the high suicide rates, the depression, some of the other challenges, the low life expectancy that sadly people in the community often have?
Well, what I'll do is I throw over to Dylan and let him talk a bit about this, maybe the emergence of states and claiming the history and identities and a bit of colonization, because it's his specialty. But I will come back and talk about the mental health and the suicides and how that's having an impact. That's okay with Dylan.
Yeah, absolutely. Off you go, Dylan.
Oh yeah, well it's yeah. Well, I guess the simplest way I could put this is that it would be like as Bernard said, we're talking about if we start 500 years ago. I'm not going to go into a big thing, but what I would say is that straightforwardly, we all know that 400 or 500 years ago, let's say in the 16th century, that Ireland was that the Dublin Pale expanded across the country, that the English culture was expanded across the country, and this meant it dislocated the older, very old, well-established Gaelic system, which was still in action, which was still basically in action across most of the country. Now, the Pale in Dublin had been there since the 12th century, so it had its own culture, which was an English-based culture. It was an Irish version of it, of an English culture, but it was an English culture. And it was generally hostile, and hence its kind of attitude of like beyond the pale. This was an attitude after like 400 years, even from the 12th to the 16th century, of basically beyond the pale was the land that was a savage land. There was no particular, from their perspective, there was no law, there was no all this kind of thing. If you follow that process the Pale expanded in the 16th century, and it was a long series of wars, firstly out as far as the Barrow, the Laois and Offaly, and then further on and gradually heading towards the west and the north of the country, which was the last sections to fall. But the whole program of assimilation and the laws that the state had constructed, the state emanated from Dublin. The state was English in origin, and the world that was being conquered was a completely different world, as we know, this Gaelic world. But it was a real world. It was just as sophisticated. It had its own systems, but they were quite different. They were decentralized. It didn't have a centralized system of law, didn't use common law, used the law, all this kind of thing. So if you follow that over the few centuries afterward, the whole program, and it was laid out quite plainly that they would assimilate Irish culture. They had to, slice up the sections of society. Originally killing off the poets, the harpers, get rid of the
Yeah.
knowledge,
God, yeah.
and replace it with an English system. And as Bernard had alluded to, in 1922, so we get in a certain kind of independence, but what really happens is we copper fasten all of the laws that actually go all the way back to that time, all the way back to that time. And so it's very difficult to unravel what's going on now if you do not take into account that some of these laws, for example, vagrancy laws, were applied in the 1540s in Ireland. Okay, let's just take one example. The vagrancy laws were applied in England, and they applied to the poor people who were pushed off the land in England originally. Then they were applied to Ireland, but in Ireland they applied to the entire society because the entire society was pushed off its land.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
So from top to bottom, there was no poor people being targeted by this. They were made poor first, even the richest of them. Okay, you could be a king. You could be a king, literally, of entire territories in Ireland, and then you were pushed off the land, and now you were declared by the law from Dublin that you were now a poor person, and now you were a vagrant, and now the laws applied to you that you were a beggar. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
Wow.
and so this process continued gradually over time for one century, next century, 17th, 18th, 19th century, until eventually we have a shrinking pool of people as they're pushed either out of the country or elsewhere that have never really interacted with the state as such, if you know what I mean. They're those that go and settle in the towns, those that accept the system, become accepted an Irish person. And what we're talking about there is the origins of what we would call this idea, because it's a funny idea if you think about it. Why is there such a thing as even settled Irish as opposed to non-settled Irish? This in itself is a colonial concept. You know what I mean? And it only from looking at it from the perspective of the Pale as a foreign system, if you know what I mean. It's from their point of view. There's good Irish and bad Irish.
So the settled were kind of like the more compliant ones who allowed themselves to become subservient to these rules, is it?
At first they would be English colonists if you go right back to the 12th, 13th, 14th century, and that's it's an Irish form of English culture, okay? And that becomes the dominant culture after 1600s. And that becomes the culture that's the culture of law, the culture that's the normal culture of the courts, of administration, of policing, of the army, so let's say that in 1922, it's a Catholic one, ironically as well, because it predates the thing. So that culture is there all along. That English-speaking Irish culture is there all along. In 1922, all the laws are kept. The English administration's removed, but that was all kept, if you know what I mean. And so, and the English-speaking culture in Ireland is the one that becomes dominant, as we know. And so, in theory, an idea, and what it seems very pertinent, in 1963 report that we already talked about, actually refers to was it the Vagrancy Acts I mentioned?
1847 and 1824, I think, maybe.
Yeah, so it actually refers to those acts from long before the origin of the state in 1922. So it's actually referring to Vagrancy Acts from 1847 during the famine and other time of pressure. And these Vagrancy Acts, actually, there's acts all the way back, right back to 1540s, to the beginning of the expansion of Dublin at that time. And so what we would maintain is that actually the pressure and the negative impacts of colonialism go all the way from, almost genocide level contacts, and in fact genocide in the 16th century and 17th century, all the way to the continual, exactly the same language almost, and the same pressure, and in fact laws that are kind of descended from these laws, including that were actually being invoked in 1963 report to deal with travelers. And if you think about it in those terms, and this is where what Bernard had referenced earlier, the microbiome, the science of the gut bacteria that Mr. Fergus Shanahan had looked at, the professor, Dr. Fergus Shanahan had looked at, that he has proof in that sense that the traveler population predates the industrial or urban industrial world, if you know what I mean, in that regard. And that actually that is the same narrative we're talking about. That people are coming down from this. And so what it means is there was never a point where the Irish state had anything except a condition of I'm loath to call it war. It would have originally been war, but gradually over time it becomes, by law and other things, it becomes this idea that there's this other,
Yeah.
and the state is normal and these are not, and that's how it is. And gradually over time, that population gets smaller and smaller, and assimilated into the system. I hope that makes some sense.
Does, yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, Dylan. And I certainly am no expert on that 1963 report. I've heard people mention it many times, and I remember seeing the words. I think the final solution, that phrase is in there as well, which is, given the original context in which it was used in the Third Reich, it's quite shocking words to use in relation to.
But it was a kind of a strange setup, and again, it's a strange way. Like if you go back far back in time, right, the Christian monks who had walked the corridors of knowledge, who could speak different languages, well written, well schooled, and they could go out for a walk, and some guy called Fred could tip over and took a compulsion or a fit, and they would bring they bring Fred back to their homestead, and they'd beat the devil out of him because they were convinced the devil was inside of him. And my point about that is that their beliefs were so strong, regardless how they're educated. Now let's jump to the 1960s in America, where scientists believed for a period of time that a child with epilepsy or schizophrenia was a result of bad mothering, overprotection, or not loving their child enough. So they made mothers feel horrible because they believed that. And if we go to the present 1960s, these people, because all of them were state heads, it was education, it was the guards, it was religious orders, it was everyone and anyone but travelers. And they believed in their hearts and their minds that they were going to help these people, that they were going to help them assimilate. We just didn't know what was good for us.
Yes.
So from that time onwards, some of the most horrendous acts that could be carried out against human beings continued for year after year, year after year. The 4 segregated children's homes that were one was described as the House of Horrors, where satanic beatings, broken noses, broken jaws, ribs, and all the sexual abuse went on. There was the segregation, the blatant attack of traveler camps, setting their homes on fire, burning houses, the blatant protesting and death threats and being shot at because they didn't want tinker itinerant children in their schools or in their locations. They all believed in their heart of hearts that they were right, all because 1963 set out with a particular focus to project travelers in a certain light that stuck for generation after generation. Just one other thing I would add to that.
Yeah.
I believe in 500 years, let alone the last 100 years, travelers have never been represented. And that sounds quite extraordinary when we think about all the traveler support groups, when we think about all the traveler activists, to say that travelers have never been represented. Just like the 1963 report, the commission, with no itinerants involved. 20 years went on, activism. Nan Joyce comes along. She was a role model for many travelers. Indeed, our sister Chrissy, and indeed many other travelers. And you know what the complaint was in the early 1980s? Their complaint wasn't complaint, it was their slogan. They were taking the reins back off the settled people. That was the 1980s, because they were sick and tired of settled people telling them what to do, what was good for them, and trust the process and just this, that, and the other, when we knew the results were getting worse and worse.
Yeah, fair enough.
So in 1983, Nan Joyce became a bit of a political sensation. The government didn't particularly like it. She had a billboard going up around the country with a citizen traveler, I think, or citizen something. I forget what it was now. But that went on and they got shut down. So what happened then was a new organization opened up. But this time it was going to be led by settled people again. Educated settled people from a new college in Trinity College were now going to set up this one and all traveler organization. So this new organization was going to be handpicked. In the first 5 years, they got rid of all of the other traveler names. Anyone had a different traveler name had to go, and they opened up what they called the Irish Traveller Movement. But they kept one family in this organization that would now become the regional, national, and international representative body for all of travelers, with one family and 3 settled people running it. In 50 years, 2 of them settled people never give up their positions. They didn't even give it up as a chairperson. And
Yeah.
these are the people who are telling us about empowerment and collectivism and
Yeah.
community development principles while retaining power. It gets more extraordinary. No traveller in Ireland ever agreed with the narrative that was coming from this organisation about our identity and telling us that we'd no written history and we lived on the fringes and we all went around together making pots and pans. When we knew, when we told them that was a load of nonsense, the science came along and said that's a load of nonsense. Everybody said it was a load of nonsense for 50 years. So when we talk about the institutional abuse about 1960s, I'm not blaming the state because in their minds, they honestly believe they're doing the right thing. It just had the worst of outcomes. I don't think they had planned to envision. But yeah, because I don't want to go into that game of the blame game. It just doesn't suit anyone. It doesn't suit us.
No, but maybe because you said you wanted to touch on a little bit more on the mental health and high levels of suicide within the community. Talk to me a bit about that, please.
Yeah, because I don't want to sound all righteous when I'm saying all this stuff that, you know, that my life was perfect and I'm a victim throughout. I was a victim of much trauma, internally conflict, violence, because even if it grows up to be normalized, it's still trauma. It's
Mm-hmm.
And then we were getting external trauma, external forces from institutions and attitudes and mentality. So you're surrounded with that trauma. So what do you do with it? You either lie down and die with it, or you try to fight it, or you try to, something has to manifest from it.
For sure.
And that didn't cause the violence. That just worsened the violence over time because we were locked into a situation that we'd absolutely no power over. We were born into labels we had no power over.
Yeah.
And we were excluded in ways that people are still wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't see it because it's kind of like an optical illusion where one image is presented and we see that as reality. And when you factor in that materialistically and systematically and so on and so forth has improved, even around the world, science and technology. So there is improvements, but why psychologically was it getting worse? And that was our problem. We were locked into this world outside the settled one, unrepresented. And I think, and that was heightening the issues. It was causing more conflict. But yeah, Colin, yeah, it's one of those things I'm wobbling with it because I grew up in it. I know what violence is. I know what it is to run around with a shovel and a slasher and stuff like that. And it
Mm-hmm.
might sound crazy and violent, but it doesn't when you're in that world. I'm not saying it's better
Yeah,
or
no,
worse.
I get you. I
When
mean,
you're
I
in,
haven't experienced it, but I can imagine if I grew up, then as you say, things become normalized. Do you think that things like bullying in school, racist bullying in school, name calling, now thankfully we don't have segregation of children. Um, Although I've heard people from the traveller community saying perhaps we need them again because children don't feel safe at school, which is shocking. It's an indictment on the system if that's the case. You know, teachers not taking traveller kids' intelligence seriously, not nurturing it, not realizing that if children feel unsafe, they're not going to be in a position to learn or do their best. Being excluded from the workforce. Do these type of things have an impact on mental health, Bernard?
oh, yeah, absolutely. Of course they do. But briefly to go back to the violence, it grew up, I was normalized in it. And then I knew at a very young age, even knowing the difference between the settled. So I was always curious like that. And at a young age, early 20s, I decided this violence is not the answer. It's not the way to go forward. And I decided I would go deeper into the settled community and find out what was causing these issues. So that's where I became involved with activism. And I went through a trauma-filled experience, even coming away from the trauma, because you're seen now as a traitor and
Right.
letting your family down and being a coward, and sometimes your children could be targeted for it, and so on and so forth. It's not, and I don't blame them because I sensed that we were locked into something that we didn't fully understand, and I knew it had something to do with the settled world. So that was the violent part of it. The mental health issues are we're, as I mentioned earlier, we're in a strange environment, a reality, and I'm saying we're not from here.
Mm.
It's a case like, well, what do we do now? We're here anyway.
Yeah.
So we're saying that what drives these narratives, what drives these institutions and systems is belief systems. So if our representative body has a narrative that we never agreed to and science proves incorrect, and if the state has a narrative that we say was never correct and the science proves it so, That means the institutions at large, both pros and cons and fors and against and good wishes and all that, are going against each other with two narratives that has nothing to do with travellers, has little to do with travellers. Because as I said, our research in science, right down to one individual, let alone a family, genealogy, geneticists, tells us exactly where people came from. So the narrative is wrong there for starters. So it has to really start at the top level. I written in about 5 years ago, key issues affecting Irish travellers through the Senate. Colette Keller was involved, Lynn Ryan. They're wonderful people. And of course, I slightly burnt them out because, as I say, when you're people around you are dropping dead and you're bringing children to the funerals, you're more intense and you can't adopt their system. Them telling me where I didn't come from to trust the process is to say to me, take a course, go there, do that. That doesn't suit us because it clearly after 50 years has shown it doesn't work. So we needed something else. But we wrote into them and we asked them, these are key issues. We believe we know the narrative based on what travellers say. Nan Joyce, Michael McDonough, Wards, McKinley's, Mahon Jr. Every breed to see the traveller, we have it. And we know the history. And we're saying, even with science, even 50 years and 20 odd years of being pushed back, we're saying, here's the proof of who we are. Let us tell the rest of the travellers. And unfortunately, that never happened. And then I would ask other politicians, try to get us there to say, look, just if the other travellers knew this, it could change how they think about themselves and settle people in the present. That means the greatest gift I got of all of this from me, because I wanted to be dead several times, and I should have been dead several times. The only thing that ever gave me a way out of it was knowledge. Now I knew why the settled people were calling us labels, or these labels and names. Now I knew why there was segregation. I knew why, because we knew there was colonization. We had an origin story, and that changed everything. Because there is no settled people in my eyes. In our platform in Trision, there is no traveller, tinker, itinerant, Roma, settled, white, black, because we see all of them labels coming from a particular mentality to call colonization.
Right.
And the further you go back into it, that's where them labels came from. So in Trision, they don't exist. The words do, but the definition and the meaning don't. So they're no good out here. So when we're talking about travellers and settled out here, the only place we can be, again, as I mentioned before, is about 99.9% genetically related. It's a meeting of the minds.
Yeah.
And we step outside this colonial mentality and we try to analyze it that way. I'm not quite sure if that answered any of your question at all, but...
It does. Part of it really, really does. And just again on that part about the 99% sameness. There is so much more that we have in common than does separate any of us, whether it's, gender, culture, religious background, or anything else. So it's an important point to keep reiterating. So just in terms of what might counteract this historical and cultural trauma, that we can't undo what has been done, just like we can't undo the colonialism that has stolen the Irish language from the Irish and that has gifted us these institutions that we now just presume we've always had and aren't they brilliant and they're working really well, when actually they're not working all that well for lots of people. But what can we do to counteract some of this trauma and harm, Bernard? Is it a case of putting this information into the hands of the public and particularly into the hands of travellers, or are there other things we need to do as well?
I think the most important part, you've already put it in there, it's pretty much in one word, is what we can do. Not what we as travellers can do on our own, or what can settled people do for us, because that hasn't worked. I don't think anything has really been stolen, language or not, because I grew up without the Irish language, although we had the Cant language and some of the words of it. So that kept us connected to our cultural and a history. But it's not lost, it's just not understood.
Okay.
Because you can speak the Irish language and you can promote it as much as you like in Dublin City Council for the very first time since 1841, and it won't matter because you're just speaking words on top of a foundation that does not have the correct knowledge of that language in the first place. So even NGOs and ourselves, that's why we never applied for funding, because we don't want to be that kind of NGO. We're not criticizing them. We value them. We recognize they do brilliant jobs. They're brilliant people, and they are some of the kindest people you will ever meet. We're just pointing out they're doing all the right things, but they're going in the wrong direction
Okay.
because they're not listening to travelers.
Right.
And then with 50 years of stats and facts, their own stats and facts are telling them psychologically it was getting worse and worse.
Mm.
The other thing is that, again, in our platform, you're lucky in many ways that Trision came along, because this research never came from a traveler organization. It never came from a settled institution. It didn't come from Trinity College or Maynooth College or any of these fancy colleges. In actual fact, all the experts, from historian types to sociology types, not that they were wrong, they were right at the time that there was something there worth fighting for. There was an ethnicity, there was a culture, there was a language. None of that goes away. But what we were saying, what they had wrong, was that we are the Gaelic clans. We are of the Gaelic world. We're not a piece of it. We're not a group within the settled population, because we didn't come from the settled population. We are the last of that world, as opposed to be an ethnic group and seen as like, not seen as like, but categorized as other, what we'd say called genuine ethnic minorities. So if you're Rome, or if you're Lithuania, or wherever you might be in this country, you're ethnic, but you're not indigenous. Like African Americans are ethnic because they were taken from somebody else, they're taken from their own motherland, you could say. But Native Americans are seen as indigenous people. So my argument was, how would we be an ethnic minority when we are actually indigenous? And of course, it comes down to psychology. All of it does. Like, we're in this language channel with unchanged institutions. So to say the settled people haven't been influenced by English mentality would be an understatement, because they've never stopped using the systems, including the names and the labels that the English once set out against their own ancestors. So in many ways, what you have with travelers today is your living ancestors that come from that old world. We're not saying we're the same culture exactly, because all cultures change, all identities change. And everything in this settled colonial one, it doesn't matter if you identify a million identities, it's perfectly fine. Because the reality is, in our reality also, every human reality, is that really deep down, nobody truly knows who they are. Because we were born with sensations and babyhood, and we learned words, we learned language, we learned culture. So it all came from the external world. But our problem is, and it always has been, our experiences came from external forces, not necessarily from an external world. So the systems were targeting our people for centuries unchanged. We were going to live with that trauma. We were going to see reality differently because we were treated differently. So settled people wouldn't see that, because there's no vagrancy laws written against settled people. There's actually no laws written against settled people. In actual fact, there's nothing written about settled people. There's no history on settled people. There's no research on settled people. It's all about travelers, because the state, unchanged in its state, wanted everyone to believe that they were now a normal Irish with an unchanged English system, and that the travelers were the outsiders. And that's what happened for the last 100 years. So what we're hoping to do, is to heal. Because also this belongs on a global stage. I mentioned earlier how English colonization came here, manufactured it, laws, policies, attitudes, human behaviors, psychological experiments, shifting them from Gaelic mentalities to an English one, penal laws, transportation laws, a lot of trauma, a lot of violence that went to around the world. And that's the one that's active today. So if you take a step outside of all of that, you would say that in that timeline from here now in the present to when it first began, travelers are still outside of that program, that reality. So with Trivision, I was hoping to create some kind of plug-in that we keep some autonomous style about ourselves. Because as I mentioned, we didn't have a formal education. I didn't have formal education. I don't have qualifications. But yet I was talking about things and could put things together with Dylan, of course, and other people. But it still came from this mentality that I wanted to know since I was a child, what caused this? Why were we treated like this? Why did you call us names for? Where did these names come from? So that was in my mind every single day as a child growing up. So eventually we get here to prove, here's the science. Here's 3 branches of science. If we find more, we'll let you know. And yet it was this kind of standoff. And only reason why, and I figured this out, in Ireland, there's a lot of insecurity about their identity. Settled people are the most insecure people I've ever met Well, I haven't met too many more people because I grew up in Ireland. But I don't mean that rude or individual, because you're not really settled. When I say settled, I'm talking about a mentality and a language and a belief system that didn't come from here in the first place. And after we go back in time, there was a thing called surrender and regrant.
Mm-hmm.
That was a process where the English said to the Gaelic lords, give up your property, give up your land, give up your old ways and stuff like that. Give up your culture, your tradition, and so on and so forth, and adopt an English one. So this is why you have a settled Irish. It's because they, with the same Irish surnames as we do, genuinely believe that they're the default Irish. And we don't care about any of this kind of stuff. But it's just the fact that it's killing us today because institutions think we're one thing, support groups think we're another thing, and we're caught in the crossfires without any representation, without saying to the people that we don't blame the state, we don't blame NGOs. We're saying this is a complex issue.
Mm-hmm.
Give us the means and the infrastructure and the support to show you what we're trying to convey to you, because we don't have the formal qualifications. And it is not to knock education either. I mean, we value education. We doctors, nurses, and all that kind of stuff is wonderful. It's the education itself is missing something. And it's missing a Gaelic knowledge. It's missing something because it never came from here in the first place. So when we as Dublin, or NGOs as the Health Board, please fund us, help us to understand our psychology. They can, because there are two different psychologies to start with. But what they need to do is give travellers a little bit of space to work with NGOs, to work with other agencies, and to say, look, this is what we think we can come up with. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier about Trision Foundation, we got Ninessa and Phoebe and Dylan, we got a few other travellers involved. And these are travellers who already work in the organisations, but they don't want to say anything yet because they're afraid to lose their jobs. And that's a sad way to be. And that's a long history. Now, our intention is not to say bad NGO or bad settled people, bad state. We're saying that bad outcomes are happening even with good people.
Yes.
So please give us the opportunity to create our own art form. Like, thanks to Inessa, who was a psychologist when I got my mind a bit sorted out, because I was just unhinged in many ways, because there was no structure. I was left unemployed. They weren't going to employ me after telling them 20 years ago that our 9 to 5 oppressors are killing us accidentally. And I was trying to be nice about it. Because again, it's about beliefs. If you believe like the Christians believed they were helping Fred, and then they had to kill Fred to save him, it's kind of like that in a sad kind of way. The settled people have never let go hold of travellers since the 60s. And at one time when Anne Joyce popped up, she was shut down. We popped up a few years ago as the only traveller organisation in Ireland registered by a traveller, and supported by settled people, where the others are registered by settled and then supported by travellers.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a criticism. You can take all this out, I don't mind. It's not a criticism. I'm trying to say to travellers, I'm not blaming you. I'm not blaming any traveller. But look around you. As a traveller, do you think it's normal to keep going around saying, I think this and I think that? Is it normal to be in a settled environment that's unchanged, that where you have to make all the changes to fit their programs, their job descriptions, their terms and conditions? And when you do that long enough, are you not seeing their worldview? And this is why the two narratives are so mixed up, because the state isn't an empty structure. It isn't like their systems, the state. It's people.
It's people. I love that point. I make it often. The system is us. We are in the system. It's ordinary people in the system.
And them institutions are driven by belief systems and so on and so forth. So what we have, and from a travel perspective, and again, we can support it, is that unintentionally and with good intentions, it doesn't matter. The state of settled people in the state and settled people who run the organizations are the same people that we're having issues since the 1960s, even with their good intentions. And this is proven in St. Jane, say, with the statistics we see, prisons, medical, local authorities. There's all of these issues. Mm-hmm. And I'm confident that we take the path of healing, of not blaming each other and saying, let's look at this another way, where there is no blame, there is no guilt tripping, because you as a child and I as a child and Dylan as a child grew up in this world with these labels and this world around us, and we perceived it as reality. Whether it's really bad or really good, we still perceived it. And our parents grew up as babies, and they perceived the world, and their parents grew up as babies, and so on and so forth. So it goes back so far, there is no one to blame. But there's a whole lot of responsibility we can take, because just like the earlier institutions that did horrible things to children, think about this. Right at this present moment, by the same expansion of institutions and beliefs. We now have children killing themselves, young as 9 years old and 10 years old and 13 years old, and some of them were bullied over their ethnicity.
Yeah.
In other words, the narratives are incorrect on the population. Last thing I'm going to finish off, because, you know, I love ranting, is that we are totally, I won't even say anti-racist, because racism doesn't mean the same thing out here either, because we're 99.90% genetic related and so on. But it does mean stuff how people perceive racism and what they think racism is. Like in America, they have it down to a fine line that it's white people and black people. But we know prior to that in Ireland, that wouldn't be the case. Or how travellers are treated, segregated, traveller only buses, traveller only schools, and the historical genocides of Gaelic people. We would know that's pretty horrible also. But we don't do comparisons like that. We're taking a step outside of all of them labels and trying to create a healing process to say, look, what can we do now? What responsibility can we do now? And if we understand our trauma, we can stop the trauma in the present so it doesn't spill over to the next generation, because we become aware of it. So I think that's what we're aiming for.
Thank you, Bernard. Dylan, would you like to add anything to that? How you think we might counteract the harms that have already occurred?
Yeah, well, exactly. As Bernard said, it wasn't, even when we lay out the story like we are and do the research, it's again not because one culture is better than another or anything else like that. Even if it was even if we're dealing with difficult subjects going back into the past.
If we're doing that, we'd have to say Sligo is exceptional, but we're not even saying that, right? So we're
no.
You're very egalitarian, yeah.
No, not that exceptional, but but I think that what people believe, as we say, what people believe about the past, even when they don't consciously understand what that is, if you know what I mean, there's always assumptions. There's always assumptions about where things are coming from, that a lot of things are based on, a lot of policies, as Bernard had described about you know, the Christians used to burn people at the stake, and they were doing them a favor because that's what the belief told them, you know. And so, you know, what we now regard as bad things can happen because of people's great intentions, wonderful intentions, but it's all about what they believe. And we do think there has been definitely a requirement for historical, and we're trying to change that now. This is part of what we're doing, is to really get into that history and actually understand it. I think that what we believe about the past affects everything in the present, and that by researching it and getting a good picture of the kind of blueprint almost of how our systems came to be, how they are, and we, as we say, egalitarian look, we look across the board, not just focused on groups that are singled out as being a problem, but right across the board, we're actually going, well, you know, so we have travelers, there is a difference. But settled communities, as we call them, or whatever you want to call them, across the board, you know, all of that needs to be on the table of what are the origins of all of the aspects in Ireland. We know the place. We have a strange amnesia sometimes. The whole place was colonized and run over, and everyone accepts that. And yet we act like there was no consequence, in a sense. No particular change happened, and yet we're all mystified. Where do travelers come from? The more you get into it, it's really strange, but it is typical of colonized society, and one that's actually dealing with trauma on a large scale, where it actually tries to bury the past and kind of go, oh well, never mind that.
Denial is such a common coping strategy, and othering, and a split, dissociative splits, kind of going, that's not us. They've nothing to do with us. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And and I think there's much work, and there's others who've identified that, and me and Bernard, even in our discussions with other people, I think involved in psychology and other things, and we've learned about those sort of things. But yeah, it's there to be investigated. It has to be looked at. It has to be looked at a blueprint. And then I think there's a huge opportunity in all of that, because what Bernard describes and what the travelers have uniquely preserved in a way is a different mentality, a different way of looking at the world that's kind of unique to this island in a sense. And that is hugely valuable as well, as it can bring, when we kind of disconnect that kind of battle, that automatic kind of setup that we have, that problem between the system and the exclusion of travelers, if you know what I mean. And as Bernard said, give some space for that mentality to sort of maybe express and develop itself in some way. Then I think the whole country benefits, and all minorities in the country benefit as well, because we're acknowledging that actually there wasn't one way, there was never one Irish way of being Irish, if you know what I'm getting at. Yeah, it never really existed. That's all an illusion created by a sort of very fairly uniform kind of, nationalism in the 19th century, and we understand about that. But it kind of paints this, and me and Bernard have talked about it in historians. It paints this kind of eternal image of the past, and there's this one particular type of Irish culture and all this, which of course is nonsense, because there are actually a lot of diversity, even amongst the traveller community. There's quite a bit of diversity and different histories to the different people and different names and stuff like this, and it's actually much richer and more interesting than we kind of that we don't get to that because of the conflicts and in sort of incorrect, ineffective ways of approaching it, simply because we're not addressing the past in an even-handed manner, and so we're going to try and do that.
Just on that,
we think it has success. We think it has had some success.
I cut into Jane's podcast. I'm getting carried away with myself. No, but Dylan just kind of described something there when he said that travellers have a diverse background themselves. Some come from Old French, some Old English. And what I see there when he says that, I can visualize the systems, a big shield coming down and cut it off anyone on this side of the 16th century from this side of the 16th century. So what you had is the English state developing and expanding. So whoever was on this side, would it be your high ends or low ends, were now seen as this other because your lands are being confiscated. So that's why we have diverse backgrounds in travellers also. That we're not just one little group that went around. Thought I'd mention that. I don't know why exactly.
No, thank you very much for that. Do you have another couple of minutes? Because we've gone well over an hour. Are you okay for just two more?
We live for this, Jane.
All right. Okay. Well, I given your lovely backdrop with the tree in the shape of a heart and the United Ireland, United People message, I think this is a nice one. Is it possible, Bernard and Dylan, for travellers and the majority settled population to enjoy safe, healthy, kind of reciprocal, respectful relationships?
Without a shadow of doubt. I think we're already doing that. When you think about all the rights that settled people have, where do you think them rights came from? They came from the oppression of travellers over many decades. When you're singing your beautiful Irish songs and music and fiddles and pipes, where did you think you got them from? All of that. So we're already doing that. I think we need a part where we, again, in my mind, that's why I call it outside the colony, because in our world there isn't a traveller or settled, and there isn't even an Irish. All them labels just stay there. So we kind of take a space away from it, and it's a meeting of the minds. And it's kind of like saying that
I love that. Yeah.
These labels have caused a lot of friction. And if we trace them, we'll see where they came from. So therefore, now we know where they came from. We understand the damage they've caused. We can't undo the physical past. Yeah, we can. Well, yeah, we probably can. Sorry. We can undo the past in a certain way. It's how we actually change it.
Yes.
Because we can't change the physical aspects, but psychologically we can change how we think about people. So people grew up thinking that we were like gypsies in Roma, and we were thieves and robbers and carry diseases and so on and so forth. That's just going to be either subconsciously, it's going to manifest in some way through your work or through your services, and you will take it out on these people. So first and foremost, that narrative is incorrect, and not to put a shock on anyone's system. But if settled people really, truly wanted to think about this, stand still for a split moment and say to yourself, these words, this language, this mentality, this reality did not come from Ireland. So if it didn't come from Ireland, where did it come from? How did it get here? Came from England, came through colonization. So why are we using the English language, the English system, the English institutions, and the labels against the people, telling them they are this, that, and the other because the English said so over 500 years ago? Now, one more thing, settling Irish, because again, they're just labels. Let's come outside the colony and we'll see on a kind of a timeline. The present day, let's go back to the 60s. Let's go back to 1922. Let's go back to the famine. Let's go back to the first conquest. The further we go back in that timeline, there was no travellers. There was no label called thinkers. There was no label called itinerants. There was no label called settled. It was a Gaelic society and all its mixture and diversity as could be. And eventually it got broken down, chopped down, and people got assimilated 400 years ago. And they were told to adopt an English school, an English believing and seeing the world. And generation after generation were influenced with that powerful English institution that ran to this present day. So we're kind of saying that settled people and travelers with the same surnames came from the same world. And we're not trying to throw out the old pale. It has a complex history itself. It has a beautiful history. It's a guy called William Bedell. I do script writing. I'd love to do a movie on him.
Very cool.
He was a Puritan Protestant in the early 16th century. And I think he's a really cool guy. And Dylan was telling me about him, brought the Irish language into Trinity College and so on and so forth. He's a bit of a... So we've nothing against Dublin at any time. We've nothing... or the black and tan.
Good to clarify. Good to clarify.
Yeah, I just want to put that out there on record.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because we're not trying to make them any less Irish, but they'll have to one day, as Aldolph Reed Jr., a political scientist in America, when he said that they settled lecturers were trying to convince them that travellers were related to Roma, and he told them to F off.
Right.
Because that's just a load of nonsense. So if that's the high quality narrative Ireland has at the moment at these institutions, that they don't know who we are, how can they possibly be telling the world that they're the Irish then, if they don't know who we are, and if they had not changed any system? So we're giving Dublin a way out of it. It's been 1,000 years, Dublin. I think it's time to call it a day. We're giving you a way out. You become Irish and let us become Irish.
Yeah.
Because we're being blocked and they're blocking themselves, claiming an identity that doesn't match up to science or logic. So instead of making it embarrassing, awkward for everyone, let's heal. We have a lot of issues, Jane. I'm saying this openly. Yeah. I grew up with the violence. I know what it's like. And I've seen all kinds of violence. And unfortunately, so we know also how to deal with a lot of these issues, not by force or like that, but a different narrative. And travelers only believe that when they see it.
Yes.
Because most of us didn't come from a literature, school, formal education type. So showing us books or getting settled people to tell us what it is doesn't always work. Give us the means to create the arts, and it won't be your stereotypical, and there'll be no blame, because we once, many, many centuries ago, saved civilization, Jane. I'll have you know. And I think we together can save it again.
Okay, excellent. I like your vision, Bernard, and your hope. And look, there's so much to heal. There really is, obviously within your own community, but what I haven't tackled all that much on this podcast yet is the legacy of the famine and the general cultural and historical trauma that Irish people have and have no concept of, where many people are quite disconnected from that, and that then feeds denial and buying into the stories that we've been told by people with vested interest.
Just to say on that, because it goes into kind of mentalities where we're at now and how we think things might have been a couple of centuries ago, as Dylan had pointed out. So even to say that we go back to any period of time and say they're Irish and the itinerants, that would be a colonial thought, because the itinerants are the Irish who were pushed off their lands. And the Vagrancy Acts were an act of punishing people who wouldn't be settled.
Yes.
So if you were settled, the Vagrancy Acts weren't used against you. But under English law, you had to adopt the church, vocational education, maybe some systematic education, but you had to adopt English rules. So I traveled... Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say...
Stop talking.
No, but you struck me as there's a very... we had... remarked on a fairly positive, because people are wondering, like, well, how do you do that, and how, it's all very well looking at all that kind of stuff, but we were interested in this Supreme Court decision that had come out there a while back, where I think McDonough's were involved or whatever, but it had gone all the way to Supreme Court, and it was about the home, whether a traveller's caravan could be regarded as a home. Now, traditionally up to this, it never was, and there was an eviction order. Yeah, there was an eviction.
Never before that.
Not that I'm aware of, no, because there was an eviction order sought by Clare Council, and so just to put it in general terms, and then it went through one court and they upheld the council, and then went through another court, went through another court, upheld the council, and then eventually gets to the Supreme Court. And very interesting decision that overturned the councils on this. And although the claim from the lawyers had been based on this idea of human rights and treaties we've signed up to about human rights treaties. I can't remember exactly which one. I think the EHCR, which I don't even know what it stands for, but anyway.
European Convention, probably, of Human Rights, maybe.
Human Rights Convention. I think it was the general one like that, yeah. And so anyway, the court decision was made based on not even on that, but on the Constitution, actually, which is interesting because it's coming up this week. But on the definition of the home, which actually gives quite a good protection on the home. But interestingly, it only applies to the settled home up to this point. To what there's a definition still, even when it's interpreted in the Constitution, there's definition behind it of the fact that a home has to be
like a bricks and mortar kind of home.
Yes, and that's fascinating because actually in the 17th century, a stone house they were called English houses by the Irish because they didn't build in those ways. They built them out of wattle and various things like this. So these even stone cottages and things like that were called English houses back then. And so again, the law right up to that point. Now the judgment was given against the councils and in favor of extending the interpretation to travellers' home, even if what normally would have been regarded as temporary and nomadic and all that, and that it didn't warrant protection. But then I think it was Justice Hogan or somebody who gave the judgment, gave protection, said that actually you don't even need a human rights treaty, that actually the Constitution will give protection, that this is a home, and off we go. Now, actually, a very simple change in these laws that we've been talking about and where they come from. And actually, I was going to point out, the judge referred to the fact that after 1922, that in the 100 and odd years that the state had failed to really acknowledge basically that the laws we'd inherited hadn't really done any favors to travellers and people in that position. And so there was an acknowledgement. Now, he didn't go back before that because I presume he's dealing with this.
He does like history, though, Judge Hogan. If it was him, he's quite a historical scholar, so he might love your longer trajectory.
He's actually George.
Okay, so that's really interesting that you say it, because we actually almost would say that I didn't know that, but we would almost say we know that because his judgment was based on information, on an informed knowledge of the past, which is exactly what we've been talking about all the way through this, and it allowed him to allowed him to make a judgment that actually to allow him to interpret the Constitution in a way that's beneficial to travellers, and it sets a precedent that actually allows that space to exist that Bernard was talking about, and allows the state to sort of back off a little bit and say, okay, so instead of it being a full conflict about what's a house and what isn't, and you have to move on and all this, just allows us now to work on what's different, that there might be different ways of living and different ways of arranging houses and traditional ways of doing it and the ways traveller lives, and that maybe the state can accommodate that, and that now we have to work out how that can be done and allow that culture to create. And I think that benefit everyone on this.
For sharing that, such an interesting judgment. Sorry, Bernard, go ahead.
Yeah, that was George Hogan. It was on 31st of January 2022. I remember it being the 31st because it was my birthday, and I was like the best birthday present ever.
Yeah.
And then there was a follow-up court, a high court, where it was to do with horses in a home. And that high court had referenced the Supreme Court ruling and the home being the definition, but also recognized that horses were part of the traveller culture. So the horses could stay, something to that effect.
Okay.
So, and now if you think about this in an interesting way, them laws of allowing travellers to do A, B, or C are old Gaelic laws also, because what the judge was doing was reversing old English laws that seen the travellers this way, and he was reversing them. So for me, it kind of touched on the 1916 uprising, where a lot of people felt it would have failed. I think James Condy would be pretty proud. We've seen a lot of stuff today, not with travellers so much, unfortunately, but he was seeing all the social work, all the employers' rights and stuff like this. So for me, it touched a bit on that George Hogan had written into a piece of history himself. He did what many of the Gaelic revivals were trying to do, was to change the old institutions and the systems. What it did for me was, because I felt many days, I'm 49, so I was used to this 45 years already. It's been a long time. And I'd given up hope many times. I cried. I wanted to turn back. I wanted all that kind of stuff. I just wanted it out of my mind. But I lost hope. I became disenfranchised completely, lost all sense of reality almost. But when that came along, it gave a glimmer of hope, because no matter how hurtful or spiteful things might work out, or tensions might be with the settled people, or letdowns or put downs, that there was actually part of this colonial institution that was still just and fair. And if you could reach it, you could change it. Or it would let the judge, if he felt it was fair enough, he would change it. So that gave kind of hope, where in the past you're really left to the whims and hopes of settled people in general. Will they or won't they? Will the judge, will he or won't he? And yeah, and all the other thing about there's been since the 60s, it was recommended, actually since 1948, Authorization Act law or something, I think it was called, even further. Patrick Neville would be a great guy for this stuff. He focuses a lot on this. But in terms of the state targeting travellers at a very early date about movement, that's been suggested in the 1963 report also, that the local authorities would keep travellers moving. In other words, wear them out, tire them down, and then they'll be very happy for a house kind of thing.
Okay.
So in 2002, they've written into the Miscellaneous Act 2022, the Trespass Act, I think it's called, that outright ban travellers from parking anywhere within a 5 mile radius of anywhere. So you couldn't be anywhere, because you'd be arrested, and you could get 12 months in prison, I think, or €3,000 fine, your home confiscated. So this was a huge attack on this culture. Again, I don't think people in Dublin were deciding they were going to be horrible about this. Some of them probably wasn't very nice, but it wasn't an intention of evil acts. Because even with the kindness of these acts, or the goodwill, or whatever was put into them, they most certainly had devastating consequences, from the suicide up and down the country. Like, we didn't have these issues a few decades ago. Like, a suicide was a shock to travellers, let alone numerous suicides, and then children start killing themselves. So that's
and it is at epidemic levels in recent times.
Yeah, and the fact that it's intergenerational, because it was actually, we had much harsher times in the 60s and so on. So had everybody else, as a matter of opinion. A lot of people had it tough, but at least we lived longer.
Yes,
and we were more confident in ourselves. Now the world has materialistically gotten better. Services got better. People are more friendly. Less of the detentions and the name calling, but psychologically, it had gotten worse. And again, as Dylan said, I'd say that good intentions, going the right direction. The world looks like it has a particular image. It looks well, but psychologically, there's something not quite right. And I always truly believe it's to do with both all the narratives. And again, we're using science now. That's a big difference. The science wasn't available X amount of years ago. So history was very contested and debated and ambiguous and so on and so forth. But now we're putting the science on
putting it all together.
Yeah, and saying, look, we think this is what happened. We're not even blaming anyone, because it can only get embarrassing if Aldous Reed in America, Yale scientist, or Pennsylvania, wherever he was, if he thinks the Irish people don't even know who they are, and they're telling him who they think travellers are. Well, if we can correct that, I think we create a whole path of healing that bypasses a lot of hate, a lot of trauma, a lot of contempt. Because there's one thing you mentioned, you're absolutely right. None of this trauma, like I said, travellers have never truly been represented. Well, no one on the island has truly been represented, because we've never talked about our shared history, our shared trauma, the intergenerational trauma. It's all been suppressed and told to forget about it, and it's in the past and it's no good. And I believe it's manifesting throughout all of Ireland. So I'd like to think we're all on board on that path of healing.
Well, hopefully, and again, that decision by Justice Hogan, I think, was very significant as well, for recognizing that a home, really, it doesn't matter what form it comes in. You know, it should be able to be a teepee or again an old trailer back in the day. But obviously, it was very significant given the timing and the fact that had never been recognized before. So thanks so much for sharing that with me, Dylan. Last question, lads, and this is one that I ask pretty much to everyone. We may already have covered it, or you might think there's little that can be said given our colonial institutions. But what can politicians and policymakers do to promote a safe, healthy childhood, really, where people enjoy positive relationships, and across the life course. Is there anything that can be done?
I'm no doubt there can be a lot that can be done. As Dylan had touched on, this can trigger a lot of people because there's a lot of trauma on the island, even recent trauma. And when we look at taking that step back, Ireland went through a lot of physical violence over centuries of it. It went to the Troubles in the North and various other tensions and various other violence. And somehow or another, we've seemed to put that away. We seem to think that we're better than that. We're beyond that. We know more than the previous generations. So I think that's a really good place to start decolonization and about a healing of the mind and a meeting of the mind and all that kind of stuff to say outside of Catholic Protestant belief systems, what is it we can do going forward now without blaming each other and triggering emotions and whatnot. But I don't think some political parties are be less inclined to get involved because I am convinced most of them have an embedded shame and guilt already. The fact that they are well-schooled people, but they didn't know this. And I don't want anyone to feel bad about it. They'll think, well, I don't care about it. But I think they will care about it when they go to an international stage. A friend of ours, we talked to her from the Belfast University, we had her on for a podcast, that told us that she went to Canada and she started talking about colonization and decolonization, and they told her to go back to Ireland and work with the travellers.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, so in other words, the international world is learning quicker about travellers than the state themselves. And actual fact, we've spoken to several universities around the world and German scholars, and we have a professor from Germany coming on next week or the week after, because now they're starting to see our narrative backed with science makes more sense. And I think it'll be unfortunate for the politicians of Ireland to be caught kind of red-faced when they're asked about who's travellers, why did you do this to them? Why did you not know you were continuing with the same English systems? Did you not tell people that they were living under the threat of war within 36 hours by David Lloyd George? Did you tell the children that the systems we're using, children, are not originally from here, but we're going to try to work with them and we're going to do our best with them? And there is no others and there is no racism. All that came with the old system, children. And now I think we'll build a much healthier mentality and environment.
Thanks, Bernard.
Only through Trision Foundation.
Yeah.
With our 12-step program. When you hear me or any individual and ever talking about we know what's best for somebody else, then you know we're full of it. Because no human being on the planet knows what's good for somebody else. But we together come up with amazing stuff, I think.
Thanks, Bernard. Dylan, would you like to add anything there?
Well, I think that I mean, I'm biased, but I think that I think the more historical research done on these things, I think it needs to be applied. I think the historians and archaeologist types, I think they need to be less corralled in a way. Now, I might regret saying this in a way, but I think that I think that it's important. I think that the application, I think that, like I said before, what we understand about the past, even when it's really has direct implications for how things are interpreted in the present. And I think it's important to bring that together, you know, in these kind of things. And I think that too often the history and that is not applied directly to problems in the present, especially these problems that are inherently, now it doesn't apply to everything maybe, but it applies, these problems are inherently historical problems, you know. And so, you know, it can allow us to get that little bit of room for maneuver. And I think that I just say that to create that environment, as you said, for children and everything, and politicians, I think it's stepping back and accepting that can be done. That there is a diversity in Ireland. It's been too long, sort of like, how do you put it? And I guess it's understandable in Ireland, but the fear of insecurity and a fear that if they take let this happen in this part of the country, that there'll be an insurrection tomorrow or something. You know, it's almost instinctive in Ireland. But I think they have to let go of that. I think they have to understand that the diversity, various diverse cultures and opinions on the island need to be allowed to flourish to some extent.
Yes.
And all I say as well is that that judgment we talked about, and Judge Hogan's probably shown part of the way that the system can actually do it, and that it can quite easily, by a very small tweaks, almost change what was originally kind of laws designed to be almost hostile into ones that are allow that space and allow the development to happen, and allow people to have to learn about that rich history and reconnect us to that history in the past. Because that's another aspect of this. It's been split from not just travelers, but actually even from the general population.
Yeah.
Is not connected really to that Gaelic world that we're talking about. And it really doesn't matter what your own origin is. The fact you're on this island, you would need to know about that kind of past.
Mm.
And yet that's all kind of disconnected a bit.
So
And
true.
yeah,
Yeah, I do some movement medicine because I'm interested in stress and trauma and just trying to manage overwhelm in general. But there's some kind of they'd be considered very dippy hippie by most people, ancestral healing and looking at lineages and looking at cultural trauma, and Thomas Hubel as a whole movement on collective trauma. And a lot of it does go back into the ancient past where people have no conscious memory of anything. It hasn't been done directly to them, not even to their grandparents. But I used to roll my eyes at the whole 800 years of oppression, kind of going, would people give over a bit, whinging on about this? But there is the simple fact that there is the unprocessed, undigested wound there at a collective level, various wounds at a collective level. So
yeah. And
healing.
new research, I mean, new stuff shows these epigenetics where it
Yes.
actually is coded into people over the generations. So there probably is something there,
Yeah.
What happened
The
there
hippies were right.
I think what happened there also is because the institutions arrived and the acts and the laws came up and they created this kind of barrier. So you're always being pushed back. Is that all that trauma was there? Like we got the intergenerational trauma. Grandfather was murdered. Mother died when I was young, and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of trauma, and that goes right across for a lot of travelers. But with that intergenerational trauma also came culture. And the love for your mother has, and the good beautiful aspects of your culture, and the horses and the dogs and the friendships, and all of that is still there in the midst of all that trauma. But sometimes, unfortunately, when we think back at it or we look at it, we see the trauma first, and we kind of forget about the good times and the wonderful times, I think, or the culture, that connection.
And that's such an important point in healing for Native Americans and other groups that have been colonized and oppressed and subject to white supremacy and other, harms, is the finding the culture again and elevating it and finding strength in those old traditions. There's a lovely guy called Sean Ginwright who does healing centered engagement, and it's all about the strengths, surfacing them and not just looking at people like they have all these problems or deficits. It's the kind of what's right or what's strong with people.
That was one of the key things, because when you take that kind of step out from the whole Western mentality, because that was manufactured in Ireland, so there's connections, there's similarities, there's a class system, there's a kind of a triangle mentality where everybody's working class, middle class, manager, and it goes like that. Churches are the same, courts are the same. All that mentality is very individualized success upwards. And when we look at that and we see this, what's happening to Native Americans and other communities around the world, we're not comparing our suffering with them. But what we're doing is comparing the commonality. Is that the foundation that caused 800 years of oppression here then went to other parts of the world and start doing it, regardless if it was worse or better or up or down. All of us had an origin experience with colonization. And of course, we can go back to Rome. So I think, I think there's just endless stuff that we could be doing. And I think we would become a global healer. Because, again, it's just stats, facts, and proof that we've been saying what we've been saying for right across the board, without even meeting other travelers, knowing what travelers' names were. We all had the same origin story. We all knew where we came from. So I think bringing that to Travel Vision, where it isn't a travel organization, as you can tell, there's settled people involved, and it's also open to all groups. So we have more commonality sometimes, and this sounds strange. Maybe it does sound strange, maybe it doesn't. We have more commonality and in common with African Americans, with Indians, with Muslims, because they all come from non-industrial cultures that are similar to our own. and our own belief systems and our own values. And we keep getting that the whole time when they say, yes, when I meet a traveler now, I know who the traveler is, because it's a psychological thing that they can relate to. And all of them, if you think about it, whether if India or Africa or anywhere, we also have something else in common. There was a common denominator called colonialism that went to India, that went to the African continent, that went to various other places. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, all these settled people with the same surnames, it makes more sense that they came from our world once upon a time, a Gaelic world, and then got assimilated in the exact same way that's happening to us right now at this present moment. Mm-hmm. And of course, with the introduction with support groups and having no kind of political system or representation, but rather handpicking which traveller will represent you. And that traveller will represent you, and they'll say whatever they say, and that has consequences. I think we can sort of loosen that a small bit without people feeling bad about themselves or guilty. There's endless stuff that we can do to get our through the meeting of the minds with educated people like yourself and Dylan, and mad people like myself.
Yeah. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'd be delighted to work alongside you guys in any way that I possibly could. It's been so interesting, as I knew it would be, learning from you both. So thank you very much for taking the time, a lot of time, to be with me this evening, Bernard Sweeney and Dylan Foley. It's been Relationship Matters with me, Jane Mulcahy, and as I say, I've had a ball. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Jane. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Thank you.